Emotions Matter. Brought to you by emaw.com. That's EMAWW.com. Your solution for emotional intelligence. Welcome to the Emotions Matter podcast. I'm your host, Monique. It is an honor and great pleasure for me to introduce my guest, Rhett Samuel Price. Although he is better known today for his work as a voiceover talent and audiobook narrator, Rhett has previously served for 21 years as an officer for the California Highway Patrol, as a sergeant in the Motorcycle Division and the California Highway Patrol's Southern Division. He has also worked as a public relations officer for the California Highway Patrol's Southern Division. Rhett has been interviewed by many on-camera journalists about his work, including Geraldo Rivera and CBS Evening News' Dan Rather. He has been involved in many high-speed chases on the California freeways in pursuit of criminals who flee from the scene of the crime. And now, I'd like to welcome Rhett Samuel Price. Hi, Rhett. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me here, Monique. It's a pleasure.
There's so many questions that could apply to our mission on providing information about emotional intelligence, but what I'd really like to hear first is why you decided to join the California Highway Patrol.
So it's kind of a funny story. I was working as one of the traffic reporters for LA Traffic, Paul Johnson and Metro Traffic. He hired me on. And as that reporter, I was being sent to a scene of a traffic accident. And knowing that reporters were allowed to go in and, report on the scene, I drove up and I was shooed away by the CHP officer that was there. He refused to let me into the scene. And as I drove away, I thought to myself, you know what, I'm going to fix this and I'll make sure that I can get into any traffic scene that I want to from then on. And I actually did go and apply, took the test, passed, obviously, went to the academy, and that was one of the impetuses for becoming a highway patrol officer. Not the most noble, probably, impetuses of all, but it was one of the factors. But I did also want to serve the community when you really look at the underlying factor, and that was to give back to the community and be able to provide as well.
So once you actually joined them, did you give up the reporting end?
Oh, yes, you had to leave all other things behind because when you join any law enforcement agency generally has an academy. Not all do. There are some sheriff's departments and some police departments in smaller communities and towns that don't necessarily have a long-term training process for you to go through. But in California, there is a peace officer standards that you apply. And for the CHP, you do have to go north to Sacramento, California, west Sacramento, California, to the beautiful Highway Patrol Academy there. And you get to spend 6 months learning how to be a CHP officer. So that's one of the requirements. You obviously can't have a job and stay at the academy because it is a live, work, eat, and sleep academy. You're there basically 24/7, 5 days a week. And now I hear some 20 plus years later that it's 6 days a week there.
Can you recall and share with us what kind of training you actually had to undergo? And if you think that may have changed a little bit?
Training was very intensive. There was a lot of class study. You had to learn the law. For most people, they're not familiar with the differences between perhaps their local state troopers and police departments. But in California, the separation is fairly easy. In California, you have either the sheriff's department, the police department, or the highway patrol. The sheriffs and local police departments, their main Bible is the penal code. And those are crimes against persons and property. For the California Highway Patrol, their main Bible is the vehicle code, traffic law enforcement. And the idea based behind that is that While the main Bible for the sheriffs and PD is the penal code, they can also enforce other codes. The vehicle code, they can enforce streets and ways, the harbor code that's out here, health and safety code, and the highway patrol is the same. While the main Bible is the vehicle code, they can also enforce the penal code, harbor and safety code, health and safety as well. Now, what that means is simply is that if a highway patrolman is driving by a bank, say for instance, and noticed that a bank robbery is going on, he or she is able to stop the bank robbery, arrest the robbers right then and there on the spot. But they would turn any investigation after that over to the local police or sheriff's department, and of course the FBI would be involved since it is a bank, for the further follow-up investigation and for prosecution to happen. Conversely, accident happens on a highway, the local policeman can stop them, or the sheriffs can stop for that accident or the traffic violation, and they can issue a citation. Most people are under the false impression that a police officer on the freeway is not able to stop them for a speeding violation, and that's absolutely not true. It's just generally they don't here in California because they may be in a different jurisdiction. And I can say that for one particular office that I used to work for, we had 5 different courts that encompassed our small area of responsibility. So you really had to know which court to cite the violator into. And if you're from an outlying area, you may not know that. So that's why they don't do it. But that's the main difference. And the training was very intensive up north, as I said. So you had to learn the vehicle code and you had to learn all of the other codes as well. They taught you how to fire a weapon. Physical agility and physical strength was very paramount. I mean, starting in as the newbies, the freshmen in the class, we had to be in the gym at 4:30 a.m. in the morning. And then once we did our 20 to 30 minutes of cardio, we went out on our run, and then you had to be ready to head into breakfast at 6 a.m. And then you started your classes at about 7 o'clock in the morning, and they continued on until 3 or 5 in the evening, depending on your day. Driving skills were also a major part of that, learning how to drive. One of the biggest things is learning how to deal with the many different things that pop up for an officer when they're out there on the highway.
Did they ever put you through reenactments? I mean, was there a lot of role playing in that training process?
When I went through, we didn't have reenactments. We did have scenarios that happened. One of the biggest training courses that stuck in my mind was the course on all of the officers that had died in the line of duty for our department specifically. And when I think back to that, I can remember more specifically an officer who had picked up a neighborhood kid. He knew this kid from a baby on up into his teenage years. The kid was obviously going to get into no good. The officer this is a CHP officer, put him in his car to drive him home, put him in the back seat, but he didn't follow safety procedures, meaning he didn't search him. He didn't handcuff him in the back of the car like he was supposed to. And he was driving him home. And for whatever reason, this kid shot him in the back of the head. So
really,
that was a very, very stark reminder.
That's pretty shocking. I was not expecting that. Mm-hmm.
Neither did I.
Wow, that's terrible.
We also had instances of one of the major losses for us, which happened in Newhall, California. And that's when we had 4 officers who were shot and killed as they were responding to some heavily armed criminals at that time. They were officers Walt Frago, Roger Gore, as well as Alan Enpence, who were killed when they were trying to apprehend these criminals. And that was a major case because it changed how law enforcement across the nation actually approached criminals and actually tried to take them into custody. That was a big, big policy change for a lot of officers. And again, they were officers Walter Frago, Roger Gore, James Pence, and George Allen.
What was the change? I mean, like obviously with the young man, he should have been handcuffed or restrained in some way, or at least checked, correct, before he was put into the vehicle. But what would have been different with trying to apprehend the criminals with the 4 police officers that got shot?
Well, for the Newhall 4, what changed there were the tactics used in getting the criminals out of a car or getting them into a position where you can arrest them safely. In the Newhall incident, and I'm certainly not indicting any of the officers. I mean, they were doing their job at the time. But what it showed was how to apprehend the criminals safely. A lot of times you'll see it on television today. You'll wonder, well, why don't they just rush up to the car? Why don't they just simply send the dog in? Or why don't they just simply do this or that? This is what I would do. Well, no, a lot of the things that you might be thinking you would do are what happened in the Newhall incident in some cases. And because of what happened in the Newhall incident, what you're seeing now and how law enforcement approaches a vehicle, and I'm speaking specifically from a vehicle standpoint, because it's kind of funny. The sheriff's department and LAPD think we're crazy, and I'm using LAPD as a reference because of the police departments out here, and I'm sure it might be the same other places, but they think the highway patrol is crazy because we will walk up on a car not knowing who is in that vehicle. They think that is just the most outlandish thing that anybody can do. And conversely, we think they're crazy for walking into a building with a number of rooms and they don't know where a criminal is and trying to search through there to find that person that they're after to apprehend. So a little inside humor for both departments there. But it is. But overall,
you're both crazy.
They're all crazy. You can say
you're
that
all
to a
crazy.
certain extent.
Yeah.
No, no, very sane, very sane. Believe it or not, one of the tests is a psychological exam. Most people don't know that, but I can speak for the Highway Patrol and I can speak for law enforcement here in California, certainly. That all of the officers that go through a very extensive psychological examination. And it really begins in the hiring process. As one of the sergeants for the department, I became involved in the hiring process and sat on those panels. And we vetted, myself and the state civil service person who was a civilian that was chosen by the state to sit in on these hiring panels with me. We would do a lot of psychological testing, I guess you could say, right there and during the interview as much as we could. We're not actually psychiatrists or psychologists in that way, but you could tell pretty much by the person's responses and their background and how they responded to the questions we presented, what type of demeanor, what type of attitude they possessed. It's not something that you rehearse because the questions changed. But yeah, the inside humor and jokes can be very crazy for law enforcement across the border.
Now, and of course, during the training process, even without the psychological evaluation, you're still evaluating the officer's capability and sensibility and instinct and ability to follow the law. Out of a class of, let's say, 20, do you find, what was usually the ratio there in terms of those that graduated or those that may not have been able to pass the whole training?
Well, interestingly enough, the class I was in, CTC 5 of 88, was actually one of, at that time, was the largest class to have gone through the academy. We had 128 cadets start in the academy. We actually graduated 118, if I remember correctly. So we had a very high retention rate during that time. But the goal is to pretty much get everybody through. The goal isn't just simply to wash everyone out. That sounds like a contradiction in terms, but when you think of the costs involved with getting somebody into the academy and having them there in the academy, they've passed all of those background tests that you're looking for pretty well. They're pretty much a solid person, and you can rest assured at that point that they're going to do the right thing. They're still looking, because, there are people that are very good at masking their true feelings, their true motives. I go off on a tangent because I can think of one particular cadet we had who, when you're sitting around with your counselor, there are counselors assigned to approximately 10 to 20 cadets during that time, and that's your go-to person. They're an actual officer on the department that's working at the academy. We were sitting around with our counselor, and our counselor asked, why did we join the department? And, noble thoughts came out. I want to protect and serve. I want to get back to the community. I've always wanted to be in law enforcement. These were standard answers that were coming across from most of the cadets in the group that I was in. And I remember we got to this one particular cadet, And their answer, gender neutral, their answer was because of the badge, the power, and the gun. And I can tell you that cadet was gone the next day.
Oh, were they
There was no
kidding?
tolerance
Were
for
they
that answer.
kidding? I mean, do you think that was a joke or
No, they were dead serious. No,
Wow.
they were dead serious.
Wow.
They were dead serious. And so, they were literally gone. They were washed out the next day because that was a huge, huge red flag. I mean, the rest of us were sitting there, our jaws dropped and hit the floor. We're like,
Wow.
so
It's good. That's good to know that they didn't take
it's
that
good to know.
lightly. Yeah. How did they prepare you? Because these are high emotional situations that you're in, right? And they can be kind of unpredictable. So how did they get you to prepare mentally in your training for these situations?
Well, let me start by saying that in the early days, and I'm talking from the 1920s on, 1929 is when the department was actually founded. In the early days, most of the men, because that was who was generally joined the Highway Patrol at that time, actually came from secondary jobs. They had either been postmen, heads of their own industries. Many of them were war veterans. So they had already developed the mental toughness required for the job at that time. As time has gone forward, as we get to the time and era, like when I was joining, I had also had, by the time I joined, 3 different jobs where I had been exposed to the public. And that's something that most law enforcement agencies, if not all, look for, is what types of exposure this cadet or this candidate has had in public, and how do they handle certain situations. I can recall specific questions about, name a very stressful situation and how did you respond? That's what they try to look for, to see how you were able to react, because it's very hard to take somebody that's never been exposed to the public or have been exposed in situations where they've had to handle stressful situations that were outside of their control, and put them into that situation and expect them to behave rationally, because it's very hard to do. If you can think back to the first time that you were in a very dangerous situation or confronted by something that was outside of your control, what was your initial reaction? Today, it could be totally different than it was then, but it's the same thing for an officer. And that's something I want to point out to everyone is, yes, a lot of public trust is put into the person that pins a badge and places a gun on their hip and goes out to protect the public every single day. Absolutely. That is a public trust that goes without question. But we sometimes fail to forget that beneath that badge and behind that gun is a human being. And we don't know all of their experiences, and we don't know whence they've come from, nor have we walked in their shoes. So it's very tough to judge a lot of the immediate choices that are made in very dangerous situations. I'm not talking about recent police shootings. That's a whole different subject that we can talk about or get into. But I have seen it in my own experiences. Young officers who are suddenly thrust into this very highly dangerous, volatile situation that have not had that life training, and they react differently than the 35-year veteran who's pretty much seen it all. And that's kind of what you will see today in some of the situations that come up. But I guess the way to look at it this way is they are human beings too. They want to go home every night to their families, just like you do. Every situation that they're involved in, pretty much every situation they're involved in, could potentially be a life or death situation. Just like I mentioned with that other officer, here's somebody that this officer knew as a kid, growing up from diapers to the teenage years, didn't think twice about putting him in the back of a patrol car to drive him home to take care of him. And it ended up costing that officer his life. I guess the way to look at it is that, when an officer approaches your car, I used to be asked this all the time when I taught traffic school out here, is what's the best thing to do? And the best thing to do is just comply with some of the orders that they have. If you have an issue with what's going on with your traffic stop, you absolutely have the right to have a supervisor come out there and deal with the situation. You absolutely have the right to turn on a video recorder or your cell phone or whatever recording device you have on there to start recording the incident during that time. You absolutely have that right. I don't care what anybody says. That's a Supreme Court decision that will stand down. You have that right to record the incident. You don't have the right, though, to interfere as a bystander, meaning get in the way of their arrest. You don't have a right to question their specific judgment during that time of arrest. That's not the time to do it. The time to do that is in court.
Mm-hmm.
That's the bottom line.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a problem with the law, if there's a problem with the interpretation of the law, do it in court, not out there on the street. Because as I used to tell the officers that I worked with, when I would get a citizen's complaint against them, foul language or excessive use of force or whatever the issue was, and I could see a problem with how things had developed during the course of that arrest, I would ask them a simple question: is why did you go to that level? Because the ball is in your court. There are only three things that are going to happen out of that traffic stop or that encounter. You're going to give them a verbal warning, you're going to write them a citation, or they're going to jail. So why is there any need for you to have to react the way that you did?
Why do you think that is, though? Why would they? What you're thinking very
They're
logically.
They're human beings. I can tell you they are human beings, as human as they are, just like you and I are. Think about it in an argument that you might have had with a spouse or a loved one or a family member, and you sit back later on and you go, why did I even get involved in that argument with this person?
That's true.
It was over something stupid.
So even with the training, some situations can just still trigger to not act accordingly.
Sometimes.
But most of the
Sometimes.
times it doesn't really happen. Yeah. I mean,
most of the time, and I'll just give you a quick example just to give you an idea of how it happens. And some don't even know it's happening. When I promoted as a supervisor and I landed in an area office, the first thing the captain said to me was that they were having a problem with this one particular officer, and the next complaint that came in, I was going to find him guilty. That was it. There was no, and I'm thinking, wow, that's pretty harsh. But it turns out that there were 12 previous similar complaints against this officer for the same thing, that this officer was rude. And so another one came in, and the commander said to me, this is it. You're going to find them guilty on this. I'm done with this. And the commander had a right to do that, because this was an abnormally high number of complaints against this particular officer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I'm going to tell you, because I actually didn't, believe it or not. And I'll tell you why. It's because after I talked with the citizen and discussed what happened, I was looking for what actually was there. I have to write, and I had to be true to myself. I couldn't write something trumped up, because that would be a lie. That would be just as bad as finding a reason why the officer had to be exonerated. I had to find the truth. And if the truth bore out the charge, then the officer was going to be written up for that. But once I finished talking with the complainant, the truth did not bear out the charge. And the complainant actually withdrew their complaint once they looked at the totality. But I was able to see the bigger picture of what was the issue. And I had this officer purchase a tape recorder, because that wasn't, back then, that was not the norm. You didn't carry recording devices around. And I told this officer, I said, you need to tape your stops. And I'm going to tell you why. It's not what you said, because what you said was totally appropriate. It was the way it was presented. It's your look. It's your features. It's what comes across in your demeanor as you're delivering that message. And so the officer did that. And he taped himself for about 2 weeks. And at the end of 2 weeks, he walked into the sergeant's office and he said, Sarge, I want to thank you. And I said, why? He says, I had no idea how I sounded when I was speaking to people as I stopped them. He goes, I would have filed a complaint against myself. And he totally changed the way he approached the situation. Again, it was not what he was saying. That was fine. But it was how it was being presented. And he had no idea that's how he came across.
And it really triggered people's negative reaction towards him. And he didn't realize
Absolutely.
why. Well, that's really fascinating. Yeah, that's a good point. Sometimes it's
Absolutely.
not what you say,
Absolutely.
it's how you say it. I think my husband has said that to me before. I'm like, what? What are you talking about?
We're not going to go down that road there.
Okay, you're a good man. All right, so tell me, Rhett, for you personally, because I'm listening here and I'm listening to you talk, and you're very, very controlled. You know just the right things to say. So I'm going to ask you: was there any time during your career where you had to really restrain yourself, and just either say something you wanted to say or feelings you were feeling, and how did you fight that? I mean, could the feeling have been? Was it fear? Was it anger? Whatever it is, and how did you restrain yourself from that, if that even happened?
Oh, I can think of several times that I had to restrain myself. And it simply went back to the adage once I became a sergeant that I would tell the officers that I had charge over is, what good does it do? It's only going to get you in trouble, jeopardize your job. And the bottom line is there's really only three outcomes out of this. Traffic stop that I made, person for speed. I walk up on them. My Harley Davidson motorcycle was looking pretty shiny that day, I must say. But I walk up on the car and this person just begins to berate me. I mean, from the N word to being the bastard child of a bitch. Yeah, I can say that on
Sure.
He Was, I think it is. And I mean, it was just incredible, the verbal tirade this person threw at me.
Even before, this even before you even said a word?
I'd say good afternoon. Good afternoon. I hadn't even said good afternoon. I was just about to when they started.
Wow. Okay. So they were already on you. Okay.
Yeah. And it was bad. I mean, I wanted to lash that out, but I bit my tongue and I just asked them for their driver's license, registration, and insurance. I took it back. And here's the funny thing. I wasn't even going to write them a citation. I was going to give them a verbal warning. Now, after that tongue lashing, I went back to my bike and I thought about it, and I pulled open my saddlebag and pulled out my book, but I didn't pull out my ticket book. I pulled out the book that you kept track of your time and stuff in and wrote in there and still gave him a verbal warning. But I stood there at my bike for a few minutes as I was writing a citation. And when I was done, I walked back up. I handed him his driver's license, registration, and insurance, and I simply said, even after you have verbally abused me beyond all means, I'm still going to give you the original verbal warning that I was going to give you when I stopped you. Have a good day. And I walked away. And I could see him in the car just literally turn ghost white. And then he got out to try to start apologizing. And at that point, because of how he had gone before, I'm now thinking, is he going to attack me? What's going to happen? I mean, literally. And I had to tell him to get back in the car. Otherwise, it was going to turn into an arrest. Take the verbal warning and just go on your way. Now, I could have changed my mind. I could have written him for everything in the book at that point in time. I could have gone beyond that. But I take the now famous Michelle Obama line, when they go low, you go high. I decided to stay on the higher road there. And that's something that they had to deal with for whether it was 5 seconds or every now and then when they're stopped again by another officer, they think about how they reacted to me at that point in time. That's something they had to live with.
That's a really good point. And, and I think a lot of folks today, who deal with how do you handle emotional states, etc., they often say, don't take it on. Don't be baited. Don't let that other person's anger become your anger. They own that. You don't have to share it. And so you were instinctive enough to know that. And it paid off, obviously, because maybe now he won't.
It paid off.
Won't do what he, tends to do. He realizes, wow, I was
hopefully. Yeah, hopefully.
Hopefully, yes.
Well, you have to remember. I mean, when you look at it this way, people always ask, why doesn't the officer have a smile on their face when they greet me? And it's nice. I mean, they are human beings. I loved the recent video I saw of the 2 officers that were called to a slip and slide. that was blocking the road. And when they got there and saw that the slip and slide that this father had built for his kids and the neighborhood kids to enjoy the 4th of July was not blocking the road, it was in the street, but cars could still get by. Rather than shutting down the party, they got their trash bags in uniform and slid down the slip and slide themselves. I mean, I mean, that's community policing. I mean, that's being human beings and enjoying what life is as well. But those are the far and few calls. You have to remember that 9 times out of 10, they're being called to domestic violence. They're being called to the scene of injury, scene where somebody has shot somebody or has killed somebody. They're being called to investigate homicide. They're being called because, there's a report of a bomb in the house or a fire has gone off. I can remember in the riots here in LA, the recent riots, the 92 riots, Rodney King. It was amazing. We had to patrol with the fire department because people were shooting AR-15s at the fire department responding to fires. So there are myriad hats that police officers wear during that time. Firemen have hats too, but they generally revolve around a fire. Nurses and doctors wear hats too, but they generally revolve around the health of the patient at that time. And sometimes they have to take in the psychological effects of the patient. But think of a police officer. Police officers responding to an unknown situation. They have no idea. They have a general idea what the call is, but they really have no idea who the person is, how they're going to react, what's their mental state at the time, how they're going to handle the situation. Can they escalate it or de-escalate it? It's very, very tense and very, very scary for that officer handling the situation. So if you are in a situation where you are being confronted by the police and you don't think things are going the way they should, the easiest thing is to comply with what they're asking for at that time. I'm going to tell you, I got stopped by an allied agency here for speed, was written up for the speed, was written up for 4 other things that I hadn't even come close to violating, and accepted the citation. Once they found out who I was, I was invited to come down to the station to talk to the commander about getting the ticket dismissed, which I knew was a no-no. That's a felony. There's only one person that can dismiss a citation, and that's a judge. So that was a bait and switch right there. But the bottom line is I took him to court and won every single one. It was embarrassing. The bailiff even told the allied agency how embarrassed they were for them, for the way the court case went, because it was just embarrassing. It was obvious what they had done was trumped up and bad. Now, after that, a complaint was filed because it was obvious that they went above and beyond what they should have done, and that carried in their record for it. It's still in their record probably now if they're still on a department. So
Wow.
There are ways to handle that. That doesn't sound like a big deal, but believe me, it is a huge deal, because if they have to go to court on anything, if they have to testify to the validity of an arrest or something, they're dead. Their testimony now is tainted. They cannot really testify in a court of law any longer because of the severity of the charges that were brought against them.
That sense of trust, breaking the trust as a police officer, is almost unforgivable. It's not like the regular society folks who do something wrong and they get up in front of public and they apologize and everybody goes, "Oh, let's forgive them." But when the law is asking for apology, there is no apology. It's over and done with.
If you break that trust, if you lie about it and you break that trust, you're done. Because think about it, how can you trust an officer's testimony after they've lied about something else in a court of law?
You just can't.
You can't.
No, it's always going to be questioned. Always.
Exactly. And so basically, their career is over at that point, especially if, like in the case of the Highway Patrol, you're testifying all the time to traffic citations. Well, if you can't testify to traffic citations, you're no good to the Highway Patrol. There's no other place they can put you to allow you to keep your job. And I'm just using, the CHP because that's the department I work for. I'm not saying that's not the case in other departments, but it'd be pretty hard there too, because you can only stay in a certain section for so long. And I can think of, even when I was in an administrative position on a department, I was still going to court to testify on records that were kept how they were kept. I was the custodian of those records, and there's your testimony there. And if I have something in my background that says I've lied, I guarantee you the defense attorneys are going to find that out, and they're going to bring it forward in court. And as soon as they bring it up in court, your testimony's done, mute. I wouldn't trust it if I was on the jury.
I'm going to ask you something. What are those feelings that tend to really encompass your life by doing this kind of profession? Do you think that's changed since you were there and what you see on television now? And what are some ways maybe you had to decompress, or you find other officers having to decompress from that? Because, as you said, they're human.
It's different for every person. I can speak for me. I can tell you that it wasn't a sense of fear, but it was a sense of doing something stupid that was going to get me killed. And then having to, I just imagine it sitting there going, why did I do that as I'm dying? That's kind of what ran through my mind. Why did I do that? I should have seen that coming. Is that fear? Yeah, to a certain extent, you can say that. But I really didn't want to do something stupid that got me killed, or more importantly, got my partner killed or somebody that I was working with killed. So that was first and foremost on my mind when I was responding to something or dealing with a situation, is to make sure that everybody was safe. Let's put reality in fiction into plain sight. What you see on TV in the police shows, other than the ones that are the reality police shows, and even to some extent those, but what you see on TV and police shows does not happen in real life. That is not real life. You cannot make up some of the stuff that happens in real life in police work. And what we see on the news is a microcosm of what goes on across the nation in general as a whole. Now, I'm going to be honest here with you, because, when I worked on a department, I worked in 3 areas that actually encompass the area that I grew up in, which was South Central Los Angeles. And I can remember the officers that I worked with stating that there were areas that they just would never go into. During the 92 riots, I rode my motorcycle home. We were in the middle of it. My house was right in the middle of it. Fires all around, gunshots going off, but I still rode my motorcycle home because it was my neighborhood. The people there knew me, knew who I was, knew what I did. I didn't have a fear about that. Yet at the same time, the department would send in a minimum of 8 officers at a time into the same areas that I lived in, out of fear of what would happen if a single lone officer was seen there. And the funny anecdote is that they actually put it out that, nobody could ride their motorcycles to and from. They didn't say me specifically, but they put it out department-wide that nobody could ride their motorcycles to and from, but they lived in a specific area. But I knew what they were talking about. It's growing up in an environment teaches you a lot of different things. And I guess for each officer, when we look and see what happens with the shootings and things on TV, I fully empathize with the families that these things have happened to, because I can tell you that I've looked at a lot of them and I've simply said that, that's questionable based on the tactics of the Highway Patrol. I can't speak about the tactics of other departments because I don't know how they operate and what their laws are, but I know the general overall law when we're talking about shootings and officer-involved shootings. And it's sometimes you have to sit back and say, was that right and was that justified? But I can also tell you, having been in similar situations, not having had taken the life or have actually pulled my weapon to shoot, to actually fire somebody, I've pulled it plenty of times. I can also say that in those situations, it's a split-second decision. It's very easy to Monday morning quarterback what happens, but they are literally split-second decisions, tenths of a second between life or death. I can give you a class example of a classmate who literally, was one person one day, and after the incident that they were involved in was a different officer from that point on, because they described literally seeing the hammer on the gun go back and then the hammer falling on the round and the guns pointed at their face. And for whatever God's will, you want to call it, the round was a dud. And they saw the hammer going back again and falling a second time on another dud before they were able to pull their gun out and shoot the person and disable them before they could click off another one.
Oh, my goodness.
That would be a life-altering event to me.
Mm-hmm.
Life-altering event. And I can tell you that person, they were their classmate. They were not the same person after that event happened to them that they were before then.
How did they change? What do you mean by that?
This person before was very gregarious, outgoing, funny, afterwards reserved, very quick to react to sudden motions or things around them that they weren't before. You know, they could look at it and it would be funny, but the reaction they had now was more of, what is that and what's happening at that point in time. Still a very competent officer, but they were not as gregarious as they were before. They were very cautious. They were very, very quick to react to things. They were always aware of everything in and around them, always looking around behind them now, up and down, sideways. So I couldn't imagine having lived through something like that.
Do they go through psychological counseling when something goes wrong that way, or? Can't
speak to that. I can't tell that because I don't know. That's their individual preference. I can tell you personally, there were two big events that happened in my tenure on the department. Early on, we had an officer who was shot and killed on their way into work. And I happened to be the public affairs officer. And I still remember I was literally going out diving. I was on a dive boat. I was going out diving. We had just gotten past the breakwater. Cell phones were brand new back then. The phone went off. I picked it up, and it was, one of our fellow officers who knew this officer very well telling me that this person was dead, and I had to come back into the office to handle all the press for it. And I literally had to turn that boat around. I had to order the captain to turn the boat around and go back into the harbor. And the person I was diving with at that time, we rushed back in, and very traumatic incident. I have a wonderful extended family because of that. Sister, the mother, the surviving brother, and the nephew of that officer. And I said, I never wanted to go through that again. And one of the defining moments for me happened with another officer, 28 years on the department, never had an accident in his entire life, rode motors for 27 of those 28 years, was making a traffic stop. Somebody fell asleep, was on the shoulder, and as this person was dismounting their motorcycle, he was hit from behind, never saw it coming. If he had seen it coming, I can guarantee you it wouldn't have happened, but he never saw it coming, was hit, ended up dying out of that. And so now I had another extended family having to deal with all the emotions of that, living with the wife for 13 days while the officer was in a coma during that time, and having to stand there as the remote robot came forward and with the brain surgeon basically to tell the two of us, via remote, that he was brain dead and he was not coming back. There are some very, very deep, buried emotions that you deal with on a daily basis. I can't think of recently the New York police officer, Familia, who was shot and killed in front of her partner. Hearing that 911 tape brought back a flood of memories, and I'll tell you, in a flood of tears, because I can only imagine how he felt at the helplessness that he felt at that time. All I would just say to everybody is just remember that officers are people too. They're like any corporation. Wherever you work, I guarantee you're going to find somebody there that does the dumbest thing ever. It doesn't matter whether it's law enforcement, public service, or somebody working at Apple or Microsoft. There's always somebody there that everybody says, oh yeah, that's just whoever they are. You have to kind of deal with them. And unfortunately, that happens in public service too. They're not perfect. So we have to look at it as that. And for the rest of the community and the rest of the law enforcement that's out there, they do a great job day in and day out. And it's just like you said, you don't hear about it because they do it not to have the accolades, not to have it being touted as the best thing ever. They do it because they want to, and it's a part of their service, and they enjoy doing it. And for every one bad thing that happens, I can tell you there are thousands of good things that are done every day.
One of our listeners has written in a question, and his name is Paul, and he's from Staten Island. Speaking about New York, he's from Staten Island. And he says, I'm currently wanting to take my exams to be an officer for the New York City Police Department. He says, my family's having a hard time supporting my decision. Is there anything you could recommend that I say to them to help ease their fears? And you've sort of been saying that already, but maybe if you could give him, some specific direction or words that he could share with his family.
Well, Paul, that's a tough one. Hi, by the way. Congratulations. That is an outstanding choice for you to make and want to give back to your community. Only you can answer for your family how they're going to react. And I would just tell you that, remember, it is your life. You're the one that has to make the decision on where you want to go and how happy you want to be with the rest of your life. As far as convincing your family that this is the best thing since peanut butter and jelly was put together, that's not going to happen. My mother was dead set against me joining the Highway Patrol. She always wanted me to be a doctor, but once I joined, she got over it. But she was also dead set on me never riding a motorcycle. And the day I came home on a brand spanking new Harley Davidson motorcycle, she nearly had a heart attack. So
maybe she should have wished the opposite. She should have wished the opposite. She should have said, I hope you become a police officer and I hope you ride a motorcycle. And you would have come home as a doctor, right?
Exactly.
Oh, that's funny.
Exactly. But I can tell you, Paul, at the end of the day, what it boiled down to is that she didn't want to see her child, her family member hurt. That was it. And God bless her, towards the end of her life, before she passed, she did finally say that, one of the proudest days in her life was me graduating from the Highway Patrol Academy. And even prouder was to be able to say that, I was an officer every day and that I came home every day. But that lump was in her throat all the time. So that's what your family's going through. I think right now law enforcement is rated 15th on the list of deadliest jobs out there. I'm not so sure that that's going to be a comfort to your family. What I would just say is remind them that this isn't a decision against them, that you love them. You are very, very aware of their concerns. And that you're going to do everything in your power to make sure that those concerns don't come through. But would it be better for you not to do what you love and cross the street and get hit by a bus, which is probably more likely than the ultimate fate that they're probably thinking right now for you by joining the department, or being able to serve and knowing that you're happy doing what you're doing and providing to the community? And I think if you kind of word it in that way, you can find your own words because everybody knows their own family. That's probably the best way to approach it is, you're giving back to the community and you would like to be happy in life too.
Beautiful answer. And Paul, if you want to just go ahead and record this, because he just said it beautifully for you, you're welcome to do that. Now, Rhett, so tell us, you went from being a police officer for the Highway Patrol to now an audiobook narrator. And so yes, I have to ask you, do you ever pull any of this into your characterizations or the stories that you read?
I am able to. I can tell you, I can dig from the depths of despair when need be, to the highest joys of elation when needs be, and can empathize in a lot of situations because I was provided with, the Highway Patrol was a very great career. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed being a part of the department. The camaraderie there was terrific. I met 6 different presidents of the United States through my affairs with the department, multiple celebrities as well. Lived a life that was very enjoyable and fulfilling simply because of the choice that I made. And I'm able to bring that to the narration that I do for audiobooks as well. When I see certain characters and to describe them, I can think back to, believe it or not, arrests that I've made, encounters that I've had. When it comes to heads of state, I can easily think back to them. Governors, state legislators, the presidents that I've met as well, and my interactions with them to bring a little more life to the character in a more true fashion. I don't have to do a lot of research in some cases, so it's a lot of fun.
Oh, that is really pretty awesome that you do that. I think that's great. How can people find out more about you?
If they do want to learn more about my audiobook narration and things like that, definitely they can always look me up on www.thevoiceofrhett.com. I came up with the voice because that's what a commander for LAPD, actually, and my own chief, Chief Gomez at the time, used to call me all the time because I did all the public affairs. They always called me the voice. So that's how it was known when I was doing things, doing my public affairs stuff for 8 years with the department.
Wow. And who knew that would be your branding after that? I mean, it just all falls into place. Wow. What an adventure.
Yes, it does.
And I can't, I so appreciate you being honest and transparent about work as a police officer. I hope that the listeners have a greater understanding, appreciation, and empathy for the officers that are out there. Give us those 3 things that you said that a police officer has to do, because I think in some ways we can translate that into what a regular citizen should do in that situation. You said you have 3 choices, and what were they again?
Yeah, I mean, wind it up really quickly for you, and it's pretty succinct. I hope to do it succinctly. Is to look at it this way: is when an officer stops you, whether the stop is right or wrong, the officer at that point does have the law on their side. That's just the bottom line. The judges are going to look: did they have a right to stop you or not? Now, if the judges decide they had a right to stop you, and all chaos breaks loose after that because you know that the stop was not legitimate, and blah, blah, it's just going to go downhill from there. But if they stopped you and they didn't have a right to stop you, and you didn't do anything wrong, and you didn't resist arrest, and you didn't put up a fuss or anything, because that's not the place to do it. You're not going to win with law enforcement when you're putting up a fuss on the street. The place to put up the fuss is in court. And I will just say really quickly, the reason most people lose in court is because when the judge turns to them and says, do you have any questions to ask of the officer? They always say no. And I'm talking about in traffic citations, but in other situations as well. They always say no. And there's nothing you can do once you say no at that point in time to change the testimony that the officer has given. When they ask you, is there anything you want to ask of the officer? That's your time to go to town. Ask away. Now, this isn't legal advice for you to do, of course, because I can't give you the legal advice, but I'm just saying most people lose their cases because when they say, do you have any questions of the officer? They say no. The officers testified. If you don't ask them, you never raise reasonable doubt, you're not going to win. And if you have a problem with what the officer's tactics and things done, I guarantee you that department has a manual or some way of how to handle it. You have to file a complaint. And I can tell you, your complaint may not go through the first time, but if enough people complain and this officer is a bad officer, a pattern develops, and eventually they're going to be sustained, and eventually that officer is going to lose their job.
Very good advice. Thank you again, Rhett, for joining me on today's Emotions Matter podcast, and I hope you enjoyed yourself as well.
I had a wonderful time, Monique, and I will thank you for having me here. And to you and everyone out there, as always, live long and prosper.
And thank you for joining me, your host, Monique, and my guest, Rhett Samuel Price, on the Emotions Matter podcast.